time once again for Community Forum, and we are very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Andrew Bacevich. Andrew Bacevich is a retired professor of history and international relations at Boston University. A graduate of the U.S. Military Academy, he served for 23 years as a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army. His writings have been published in numerous publications, including Foreign Affairs, The Nation, The New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and The Financial Times. He is the author of numerous books also, including The Limits of Power, The End of American Exceptionalism, The New American Militarism, How Americans Are Seduced by War, Washington Rules, America's Path to Permanent War, and his latest book, which he is here to talk about, America's War for the Greater Middle East, A Military History. Andrew, thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
Well, thanks for having me on your program.
So start out, tell us, what was your motivation in writing your latest book, America's War for the Greater Middle East?
Well, I think this is it's an important story, and it's a story that hasn't been told. The story that the book tells really is a chronicle of U.S. military involvement in the Islamic world beginning in 1980. And I think most of us have a general sense that going back several decades, there's been a lot of U.S. military activity in countries from Iraq to Afghanistan to Libya to Yemen to Somalia and so on. My purpose was to put together a narrative of all of these campaigns, long, short, big, small, to make the point that we should see them collectively as constituting a war that I call America's War for the Greater Middle East. And my purpose in doing that was to suggest to the reader that when you put it all together, when you take stock of what the United States has tried to do militarily and what it's actually done militarily, with what consequences, then one, I think, reaches the conclusion that this has been a misguided enterprise. It's not working. It has failed. And if you reach that conclusion, then it becomes possible to have a conversation about, well, what should we do differently? Rather than simply plunging further on, which I think tends to be the reflex reaction of people in the policy community.
So you start with Jimmy Carter in 1980.
Yes.
So start there. Refresh our memory for those of us that have forgotten.
Sure. I mean, the start point of the story is 1980 because in 1980, Jimmy Carter, who of course is the least warlike of our recent presidents, but in 1980, Carter promulgates what comes to be known as the Carter Doctrine. The Carter Doctrine is a statement that says that the Persian Gulf is a vital U.S. national security interest. Now, in layperson's terms, what that means is, beginning in 1980, the United States views the Persian Gulf as a place worth fighting for. Why? What prompted that declaration? What prompted it was two big events. One was the Iranian Revolution, which overthrew the Shah and, among other things, created the second oil shock. And that same year, 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Recall that in 1979, it's important to recall this because it's no longer the case, but recall that in 1979, the American way of life was basically dependent upon access to foreign oil. And it appeared at that time that there was no alternative but to rely on ever-increasing imports of foreign oil in order to provide the wherewithal to live the way we want to live. And one aspect of that is to have lots of cheap gas. So Carter, in essence, conceded to that perceived reality and said, well, by God, if indeed the American way of life is dependent upon oil from the Persian Gulf, then this needs to become a strategic priority. What ensued over the course of years, unanticipated certainly by Carter, was an ever-expanding effort on the part of the United States using its military to pacify, to bring order to not simply the Persian Gulf, but an ever broader swath of the Islamic world. So Carter himself actually only initiated one brief military campaign. That was the failed hostage rescue mission, tried to free the American hostages held by the Iranians. But from beginning with Carter's successor, Ronald Reagan, each and every president has launched multiple campaigns in this region. You can tick them off. Under Reagan, a failed peacekeeping mission in Lebanon that culminated with 241 Marines killed in a single day. A brief effort to put Colonel Gaddafi of Libya in his box through a bombing raid. It didn't work. Gaddafi responded by blowing Pan Am 103 out of the sky. An intervention very much promoted by Reagan on behalf of Saddam Hussein in the course of the first Gulf War. That's the war of 1980 to 1988, nominally between Iraq and Iran. We supported Saddam. We fought against Iran. A covert intervention in Afghanistan targeting the Soviets who are occupying the region and ultimately basically turning Afghanistan into Iraq. So my point here, a key point here, is that neither Reagan nor any of his successors had a well thought out sense of a strategy, of a particular outcome. Reagan and his successors simply responded to situations where the response was repeatedly a military response. And I think from our perspective, as here we are in 2016, trying to reflect back on this long experience, the important thing to realize is it has never produced the outcomes that Carter, Reagan, the elder Bush, Clinton, the younger Bush, Barack Obama have told us to expect. So we got this great military. There's no question about it. It's a wonderful military with wonderful people serving in it. But in the war for the greater Middle East, it has been misused, abused, and has produced negative consequences at great cost to us and to sort of everybody else.
So what's your take on why each of these individual actions and campaigns that the U.S. has gotten into, why do they initiate these without a sense of the history that went before them?
Well, that's a great question. And I don't think there's an easy answer. But one answer is the false historical consciousness that certainly exists in Washington, and in some respects, I think, is shared by large numbers of ordinary Americans. What do I mean by false historical consciousness? What I mean is that we Americans, have come to view history as kind of a triumphal march led by the United States. There is a narrative, particularly a narrative of the 20th century, a narrative centered on World War II and its aftermath, the Cold War, which seems to suggest that forceful American leadership can destroy evil and transform the world in our own image. Now, I'm overstating the point, but nonetheless, the point is basically correct. We think we won World War II. Truth is, mostly the Soviets defeated the Germans, but we think we won World War II. We think we won the Cold War. We think that we are a liberator. And the reason this is relevant is because those sorts of expectations then shape the thinking of American presidents as they looked at the Islamic world, considered the problems, the dysfunction with the Islamic world, and tried to calculate the best response. I don't know if you remember the remarkable speech that George W. Bush gave in the wake of 9/11, in which he quite explicitly compared the enterprise then being launched, what he called the global war on terrorism, explicitly compared the global war on terrorism to World War II and the Cold War. Bush said, "We have seen evil before, and we destroyed it, and we brought freedom." And Bush said in 2001, "Well, we now confront a comparable evil, and we will destroy it, and we will advance the cause of freedom." The reality is that the conditions in the Islamic world, the problem, whatever the problem is, simply does not bear comparison to the problems we imagined we solved in the 20th century, in World War II and in the Cold War. So our policymakers, and again, I think many in the general public share this, have an inappropriate frame of reference that then makes it more difficult to look at a place like Iraq, let's say Iraq on the eve of the U.S. invasion in 2003, to look at a place like Iraq and say, hey, wait a second. This is a complicated place with a complicated history. And if we simply go in there and remove the regime, we are likely to let loose forces of disorder. You may remember that the Bush administration thought that by overthrowing the regime, that somehow magically a stable and democratic Iraq was going to emerge. I'm not in making that point, I'm not trying to pick on the Bush administration specifically. What I'm suggesting is that sort of naivete and ignorance of local conditions has been a continuing problem, dating from the 1980s and, quite frankly, even going forward to the present moment when people are absorbed with the problems of ISIS and the Syrian civil war.
So who are these policymakers? Are they the same policymakers from administration to administration, or is it a fresh set of eyes that come in?
Well, no. I mean, the great question. I mean, when we think of politics, there is a tendency to see sharp differences between Republicans and Democrats. And certainly on some issues, there are sharp differences between Republicans and Democrats. But it's important to realize that with regard to national security, there tend not to be sharp differences. That the continuities between administrations, between Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush and Bill Clinton, for example, the continuities far outweigh the discontinuities. Now, the politicians themselves are not going to say that. You know, the guy who comes to office is going to say, "Well, I am striking on a completely different course from my predecessor." He'll make that claim for domestic political reasons, but that doesn't actually reflect reality. I think more to the point, of the last half dozen presidents, the only one we elected who actually knew anything about statecraft was George Herbert Walker Bush. All the rest of them basically have been novices who learned on the job. We elect somebody to be commander-in-chief where, from a perspective of knowing how the world works, they actually don't know all that much. When you think about Barack Obama, I'm not picking on him, but as a first-term senator, we think about George W. Bush as a governor of Texas, who rarely traveled outside the country. All of them, each of these presidents, comes to office dependent upon basically a cadre of so-called experts. And members of this cadre, even if nominally Republican or nominally Democratic, they share a worldview. And it's that shared worldview that I think explains why there are these continuities between one administration to the next. You know, in the present presidential campaign, with the exception of Senator Sanders, who actually doesn't say much about foreign policy, the remaining candidates really all are, it's hard to tell the difference between them. I mean, Secretary Clinton, as the leading Democratic candidate, is nominally the voice of liberalism, as opposed to the ostensible conservatives in the Republican Party. But Secretary Clinton is a hawk. Secretary Clinton has vowed to destroy ISIS. Secretary Clinton orchestrated the intervention in Libya in 2011, which reduced that country to chaos. And as far as I can tell, she hasn't expressed much regret for having done that. So she is part of this foreign policy establishment. And she, but you could say the same thing about Cruz. You can certainly say the same thing about the bizarre Donald Trump, shows little ability to appreciate that historical context that I address in this book. They are oblivious to what the United States has been doing in the region since 1980 with its military. Instead, they simply focus on the here and now, as if destroying ISIS is somehow going to solve the problem. The truth is, even if we destroyed ISIS, eliminated ISIS, demolished ISIS, tomorrow, the sources of disorder and dysfunction that gave rise to ISIS would still exist. So the conversation in a political campaign ought to be about, well, what are those sources of dysfunction, and what, if anything, can the United States do? What role can the United States military play in addressing those matters? That conversation doesn't happen, and I think it's a tremendous loss.
And what role did the U.S. have in creating ISIS, the situation that, the conditions that...
Well, we had a direct role. And the point here is not to somehow say that the United States is directly responsible for all the bad things in the world. That is simply not the case. The point is not to argue that if Jimmy Carter had not declared the Persian Gulf a vital U.S. national security interest, that here in 2016 the region would be, everything would be hunky-dory. That's not the case. But on the direct point of ISIS, in 2003 we invaded Iraq. We invaded Iraq with the expectation of transforming it into a liberal democracy. Instead, we transformed it into a failed state. Out of that failed state, out of the chaos, the anarchy, the disorder, there emerged militant jihadist organizations. The first one was an entity called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, now mostly defunct, but the first cousin of Al-Qaeda in Iraq is this thing we now called ISIS. So you can make a strong argument that ISIS would not exist today had not the United States chosen to invade Iraq back in 2003.
And what was the effect of when the U.S. began its putting forces in Saudi Arabia and aligning itself more with Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, well, see, this takes us back into the early 1990s. 1990, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. We were okay with him invading Iran. We were not okay with him invading Kuwait. Annexing Kuwait seemed to put Saudi Arabia at risk of further Iraqi aggression. The United States has been committed to the security of Saudi Arabia since World War II, but only in 1991 did we face this imperative now to act on that commitment. So George Herbert Walker Bush organizes a great coalition, 500,000 U.S. troops deployed to the Gulf. Kuwait is liberated in what seems to be a great and historic victory, Operation Desert Storm. Turned out, Operation Desert Storm allowed a host of loose ends to remain, not least of all the fact that Saddam Hussein remained defiant and in power. So the George Herbert Walker Bush administration decided, and his successor Clinton affirmed, that the United States was now going to maintain forces, not simply, they were not going to come and go. We're going to permanently maintain forces in the region in order to contain, that was the term used, to contain Saddam Hussein. So that led to U.S. forces permanently stationed in Saudi Arabia, the land of the two holy places. And there were those in the Islamic world, not least of all a guy named Osama bin Laden, who found that the presence of these infidels in Saudi Arabia as objectionable, to put it mildly. And the result was that bin Laden declared war on the United States. And during the 1990s, this U.S. military presence resulted in attacks against U.S. assets. You know, the blowing up of the Khobar Towers barracks in Saudi Arabia, the attack on the USS Cole when it was docked at Yemen, the attacks on 2 U.S. embassies in Africa, all orchestrated by bin Laden. Now, the point here is not to somehow blame the United States for bin Laden's terrorist attacks. The point is to emphasize that one of the unintended and unwanted consequences of the Gulf War of 1990-91 that we thought was a victory, one of the unintended consequences then was to lay the groundwork for what's going to be further disasters. It's the blindness of the policymakers, their inability to anticipate second-order consequences, which has been an abiding theme of this entire military undertaking.
But aren't there any voices in this grouping of policymakers that basically share your viewpoints and are trying to point out that history is an important thing to look at here?
Well, Senator Sanders gave a talk a couple weeks ago in Utah. This is the speech he gave when he said all the other candidates were going to the AIPAC meeting in Washington and declaring their fealty to the state of Israel and to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And Senator Sanders said, I can't fit AIPAC into my schedule. But he gave a foreign policy speech out in Utah, which didn't get as much attention as it deserved. But the foreign policy speech, at least as I read it, suggested that he's not a captive of the train of thinking that has brought us to where we are in this war in the greater Middle East. The problem, I think, is that his candidacy really is not founded on a foreign policy view. His candidacy is founded on strong arguments that he makes with regard to economic inequality and social injustice. I personally would like to see him speak more frequently and forthrightly on foreign policy, because he is the one and only alternative voice that is in the campaign. All the others, again, to include Secretary Clinton, really are calling for, their argument is for let's try harder. You know, let's drop some more bombs. The differences are whether or not we should send large numbers of troops on the ground or whether we should rely on special operations forces and trainers. But there is no difference with regard to continuing expectations that somehow or other the application of U.S. military power is going to set things right, even though when you look at the experience of the last 30-plus years, there's simply no evidence to support that U.S. military power can provide an antidote to the dysfunction of the region.
So you have a degree in American diplomatic history.
Yes.
What was, this is kind of stepping back a sec, so what was, after you got out of the military, what was the motivation in pursuing that?
Well, I got my degree when I was still in the military.
Okay.
Yeah, the Army sent me to graduate school.
Very good.
Very generously. It was a great opportunity for which I continue to be very grateful. And through happenstance, I ended up studying diplomatic history, and then through further happenstance, I ended up getting a job as an academic. But it was through the grace of God, not through some kind of a grand plan of my life.
So, but from your readings, I get the impression that you're leaning towards the use of diplomatic tools much more than the reliance on our presidents who have seemed to rely on military options.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a pacifist. I mean, quite frankly, I think the notion of world peace is a bit of an illusion. We need to have a strong, capable military to defend us and to defend vital interests. We should just be careful about how we define those vital interests. But I'm completely pragmatic on these matters. We should do what works, and what doesn't work, we should not do. And therefore, when you take into account this 30 plus years of military engagement, it's not working. So we need to find an alternative. And when you say diplomacy, yes, but I think there's some number of people who think that diplomacy means it is akin to isolationism, is akin to throwing up your hands and saying, "Well, I guess there's nothing we can do." I don't think that's correct. I think that diplomacy in this context means to bring the country in the context of what to do about ISIS specifically. It means to bring the countries of the region, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, to realize that despite their many differences with one another, that they have a transcendent common interest in destroying ISIS, which does pose an existential threat to their existence, even though ISIS does not pose an existential threat to us. And I would argue strongly, if Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Turkey would indeed collaborate with regard to dealing with ISIS, they could handle the problem. So the diplomatic task facing the United States is to get them to set aside their various differences and to recognize where they have a common interest. That's not a trivial challenge. I mean, it's not. But quite frankly, it's a challenge that I would argue is more susceptible to being handled than the notion of, well, let's go drop more bombs or let's go send more special forces in to continue this war that has become endless and shows no sign of succeeding.
And very quickly, because we have a minute left, wouldn't the U.S. have to change its negotiating strategies with Iran to be able to accomplish this?
It would, and indeed, I think that actually, even though President Obama hasn't explicitly articulated this, I think that's the real purpose of the Iran nuclear deal. The real purpose is not to prevent them from acquiring nuclear weapons. The real purpose is to open a door that will make it possible for Iran to come in from the cold and to once again play its role in regional affairs. And the president is betting, and it's a big bet, that he is betting that Iran will choose to play that role responsibly. I mean, by extension, his bet is that the Ayatollahs, the clerics, the mullahs, the old guys are on their way out, and young people define the future of Iran.
All right. Well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
I enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.